Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our sixth AI Journal Club discussion. I hope you had a wonderful May. We skipped that one because we have the ACR annual meeting and the SIM, Society of Imaging Informatics annual meeting, which tend to be a little hectic and busy, sort of taking up the last 2 weeks of the month. So we are happy that you're joining us again. And, again, my name is Judy. And actually, this is my last month when I'll be an IU School of Medicine resident. So no financial disclosures. And as usual, I always have to remind you how you can keep the conversation going. And honestly, one of the biggest things is to just follow the hashtag RadAI Journal Club. And so I would like to thank the Advisory Council, who are composed of residents. And now we'll have 3 fellows who help run this journal club because it's pretty important. In fact, today we're going to hear from Kevin Seals, who's going to be running the journal club. So I'm pretty excited for this topic around FDA. And so, as always, I get a lot of emails and tweets, on suggestions of improvement or what you liked or what's getting better. So please spend a moment if you can, to give us feedback so that we are always improving this. So one of the things that we're working on, and we've had almost 5 residents joining, is this idea of resident liaisons for the journal club. And we hope that once we have enough critical mass, we could probably try an alternate schedule where we could have one during noon conference around 12:30. And that means we can have more participants from like the UK and all these other places where we can get them more involved. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kevin Seals, who will be hosting this journal club.
Pleasure to have everyone joining today. I'm certainly excited about discussing this with everyone and our really amazing group of panelists. So the topic is FDA approval and machine learning. A relatively painless introduction. We try to make it, as fun as FDA approval can be. It's kind of an innately dry topic, but also a super important topic. A lot of us want to innovate in healthcare, and we have a lot of great ideas and a lot of technical ability, and we know our technical machine learning, but FDA approval is a really big deal in terms of actually making those technologies a reality. So we have to have some foundation in this topic. So who am I? I'm Kevin. I'm just finishing radiology residency at UCLA. I'm about to start IR at UCSF. So I spent some time building a chatbot radiologist. I've kind of got background in engineering and interest in technology development. And as I was working on that, I was like, well, I really need some basic understanding of FDA approval if this is going to go anywhere. So, I spent some time kind of reading up on it and developing a foundation, and I'll kind of discuss some of those concepts with you today. I'm sure you're wondering, who was that super handsome dog? So the fatter dog is my dog. His name's Captain, and that's his friend Ollie there. But there are a few more photos of Captain frolicking in a field, dressed as a pizza, and there he is in his little custom suit at my wedding. So yeah, the advisory council, Judy had kind of touched base about the council, but just to give them a little credit again here, they've kind of helped with all of this and provided a lot of direction and kind of discussed the ideas and helped kind of refine the overall game plan today. So big thank you to all of them. And special thanks to Judy, who's kind of the leader of everything that we're doing here, and a lot of this has been her vision. Here she is hanging out with Jeff Dean, by the way, who's probably, among the most famous software engineers on earth. He's kind of like the iconic Google engineer who changed everything and built Google. So, Judy certainly hangs out in an interesting crowd, and she's kind of a good person to have on our team. Also, special thanks to Ajay. He was kind of instrumental in getting things coordinated today, and he's a super impressive guy, doing a lot of work in machine learning, also a resident in radiology. And as you can see here, he was dabbling in augmented reality way before the rest of us with Google Glass. So the game plan today, so we're going to start by kind of going over just the absolute fundamentals and stuff everybody needs to know about FDA approval. We're going to really try hard to not be horrifically boring. We've got amazing panelists, three of the smartest people in radiology. We're going to chat with them, and we're going to have just kind of some discussion. You can ask your questions, and we'll have sort of a dialogue with our very impressive panel. This is us having fun. I searched the images for fun, and I got this little guy running around in a sprinkler. So that's kind of the goal and the vision for what we're doing today. That's going to be us today. So going over our panelists, first we have Daniel Golden from Arteris, one of the hottest kind of machine learning radiology startups. Dan got his PhD at Stanford, bachelor's at Cornell. He's the director of machine learning at Arteris, so big, significant executive there. And Arteris is just super impressive in terms of the stuff they've done with FDA clearance. They were the first company to get clearance for a deep learning technology, and they've done some really impressive stuff in that space, which he'll tell you a little more about. Dr. Jha certainly needs no introduction. He's a professor at UPenn, a big thought leader in radiology, prolific writer. He's certainly in the top 0.5% at keeping it real. Really funny guy, really smart guy. I love his writing. Tons of followers on Twitter. As I said, he's certainly a big thought leader, and a lot of people pay attention to what he says. So he's Rogue Rad on Twitter. Next, Bib Allen. He's here as well. He's been an ACR executive for quite some time. One of the biggest sort of radiology clinician executives in the game. Currently, he's the CMO of the ACR Data Science Institute. Previously ACR president and the chair of the ACR Board of Chancellors, so also very impressive. So yeah, getting to the topic of FDA approval. So we have our really impressive technologies that can change everything, but who's going to win? Is it going to be that, or is it going to be this horrendous mountain of FDA approval paperwork? This is certainly one of my favorite meme structures. Here's one I've always appreciated. Who would win? Going to class at 8 a.m. and having a successful future, or one soft boy? Sadly for me, the soft boy sometimes wins. And credit is due here, of course, to the subreddit dank memes. So starting to talk a little bit about FDA approval and some of the key concepts that you have to know if you're going to innovate in medicine. So first, the risk class of a particular device. So the way FDA approval works is they consider both the likely benefit of the device and the level of risk. And if there's an immense benefit, you can tolerate a little more risk. But if the benefit's smaller, you're more concerned about risk, and there's always a careful balance of the two. There are three classes of risk. One is low, a toothbrush, a Band-Aid, something like that. Two is moderate, a CT scanner, there's radiation, and there's certainly some significant risk, but it's not extremely high. And then three, an artificial valve. You've got all these crazy things in a surgery with an exposed heart, and certainly there's some significant risk there. So that's class 3. In terms of pathways to approval, so the thing that I think we should hope for in terms of getting approval for our machine learning technologies is this 510K pathway. It's generally for class 2 risk devices, moderate. It's a little trickier for a class 3 device. And to go through this pathway generally, you need some sort of predicate device. So a prior device that's received approval, generally through pre-market approval, which I'll discuss in a moment. But you need some predicate device that's kind of similar to what you're doing with regards to safety and efficacy. And if you have a class 2 technology, that level of risk, and you have a predicate device, your technology is appropriate for this pathway. It's way easier than this tougher PMA pathway. Costs about $5 grand in total. The entire process takes like 4 to 8 months, and it's 20 hours of work on the part of the FDA. That's in contrast to pre-market approval, which is just absolutely brutal, totally sucks. This is for that class 3 higher risk technology or technology without a predicate. Generally takes like 3 to 7 years of clinical trials. And this 510K, it's about 20 hours of work on the FDA's part. This is 1,200 hours of work. So, it's a fairly massive undertaking. And if at all possible, you want to avoid going through that process. The other kind of smaller categories are exempt from pre-market review. You have that class 1 device, you have a Band-Aid or something, you don't have to fill out hundreds of pages of paperwork about it. It's clearly just very low risk. You can have a humanitarian device exemption. That's for a really rare disease. I believe it used to be under 4,000 cases per year. They've since changed that to 8,000 to make things a little bit less difficult with regards to approval for these rare diseases. But if you have a very, very small population of affected people, it's hard to get a really good data set to prove something works well, so they make it a little more straightforward. Then also there's this de novo approval. That's when essentially there's no good predicate, which you generally need for this 510K pathway, but risk is sufficiently low. In that case, it sort of reduces to the 510K process. Another critical concept here, the idea of detection versus diagnosis. And this is important because it has huge implications with regards to the type of approval that you can go through. So, detection is what we're accustomed to with kind of traditional mammography. We have the little triangles and the stars and things that pop up. And they point something out. They don't make any claim as to what it is per se. It's like there's an opacity here, there are calcifications here, but they don't say, this is cancer. They point it out. The radiologist looks at it and evaluates and makes a decision. So it's detection, but it is not diagnosis. And so that's considered lower risk, and the approval is easier. In contrast, you have computer-aided diagnosis, which is often what we talk about with these fancy new machine learning technologies. And that's not just pointing something out, but it's specifying a type of disease, severity, recommending a treatment, etc. So that's higher risk. You can imagine something says there's a stroke here. It's making a more definitive claim that can kind of guide care. And so that often results in a class 3 device. I like the figure that I used before here, but I was a little embarrassed because it reminded me of this article, which is talking about the big scandal of AI, these like totally ridiculous stock photos that get used to represent things in AI. So this one's a little embarrassing. This cowboy one, certainly super embarrassing. And then Jan LeCun, one of the sort of fathers of machine learning, he was talking about that paper, and he's like, yeah, some of these stock art things are pretty bad, but at least they're no longer using Terminator in every single article. So we are making some progress, certainly, and that's great. So in terms of how things are changing with the FDA approval and why things need to change, of course, I'm in California, so I'm required to give some props to Tupac here with his classic song Changes. There's some things the FDA needs to change. So there are a few things about these software technologies that don't really fit the traditional FDA system. And that's, one, the time scale of developing software tends to be months rather than years. So, there are a lot of technologies that want approval now. Within a few months, you have a brand new technology. So the FDA is sort of flooded with different software devices wanting approval. Also, there's a component of novelty. So, we have these new types of technologies, and the question becomes, for this new sort of technology, what type of approval is even appropriate? Do these decision support things even need FDA approval? How about some simple app for patients that just gives some basic information about their health? Does everything like that require FDA approval? These new smartphone apps are kind of creating a gray area that didn't exist before. So one approach to dealing with those issues is this 21st Century Cures Act. Went into effect December 2016. The thing's absolutely enormous, and it covers like a billion different issues, just generally trying to make medicine more efficient. It targets like the opioid epidemic. It talks about like selling crude oil to generate funding for different things in healthcare. Here's actually a photograph of Bill Gates standing next to the printed 21st Century Cures Act, which, as you can see, is quite large. So it does a number of different things to make FDA approval more efficient that are sort of being rolled out now. One, it provides some clear, unambiguous definitions regarding the approval of decision support tools, which is really helpful because, there was a lot of confusion and people are really waiting for the FDA to kind of definitively say whether or not some things need approval. In terms of breakthrough devices, things that can really, really help a group of people that are kind of new, but, there's some significant evidence that they could really change things for someone with a rare disease or really any disease. It kind of streamlines the approval process. And then there's a lot of verbiage about just generally making the process less burdensome for people. For example, it specifies training specifically and kind of not being burdensome, being a burden for the FDA people, and just kind of changes their philosophy a little bit to make things easier. I remember, when some of this stuff started getting rolled out, everyone was talking about it on Twitter. Here's a tweet from Kurt Langloss about it, just kind of talking about how we now have some clear information regarding which decision support tools require FDA approval, and kind of defining some things there. In terms of other changes to the FDA approval process, there's a lot of talk about this fast track system. That's basically, it's based on the logic that the software is being developed really, really quickly, and there's a ton of it. The FDA is super overwhelmed. So what do they do to deal with this massive volume of potential approvals? So they've actually decided to sort of copy the TSA, strangely enough, and they're creating a sort of pre-certification program for different companies that kind of have a known level of quality and a known standard. So you can imagine if Google is developing a technology, Google's pretty legit. They have a track record of doing really impressive things. They're probably going to be careful and rigorous with the data and so on. So if they do some initial approval process similar to TSA pre-check with the FDA, in the future they can kind of operate more independently with audits occasionally to make sure that their processes are up to snuff and they're maintaining an appropriate level of quality. But they'll be able to kind of act a little more independently without FDA approval and intervention at every step of the way. And right now there's this pilot study going on with Apple, Fitbit, Google, and Pear Therapeutics, which sounds really cute and adorable to me. Another issue dealing with the dynamic. I wanted to find a photo that captures dynamic, and I thought this one of this corgi jumping through the air coming out of the water slide was pretty good. But this just kind of gets at the idea that these technologies are actually changing. So if you have a machine learning algorithm and it's continually fed data, theoretically it could be getting smarter and smarter, and that's what we kind of think about, and that's the goal. But the question becomes, what if it gets bad data and it becomes dumber? You can imagine something's approved by the FDA and it works, and they give their stamp of approval, but then as new data comes in, if there's some issue with the data, it could kind of stop working. So it's kind of this new issue of how exactly does the FDA deal with this sort of dynamic stuff? And there's a lot of debate as to how they're going to do that, and what the solution might be, and it's kind of unclear, and we can talk about that a little bit today. So yeah, that was a lot of information about the FDA. This is kind of how I felt as I was doing some of this research. It's pretty dry, but good news. We are on to our super fascinating panelists, and that's going to be a lot of fun. Starting with Dan from Arteris. This is actually Fabian Beckers, their CEO. I've superimposed him here on top of Daniel Boone, the pioneer, because they've done a lot of really cool pioneering stuff with FDA approval. But we've got Dan here in the mix as well, and he'll kind of talk a little bit about Arteris and his really nice practical experience going through the FDA approval process. We'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks a lot, Kevin, for that introduction. I think my audio is on, and I assume someone will tell me if it's not. My slides also were originally all of Corgis and two-pack quotes, but my marketing department asked that I remove those, as a half-truth. But what I'll go ahead and do is explain a little bit about the application that we made that inspired Kevin to make that really amazing photoshopped picture of our CEO and Daniel Boone, which is our software, which we call CardioDL, which we like to say was the first ever software that was cloud-based deep learning software cleared by the FDA. And what I'm going to do is describe a little bit about the software and then a little bit about what we did to prove safety and efficacy to the FDA. And I'm not going to go into the other 98 pages of the 510K application, but they governed other aspects of the software that were not the modeling aspect. So let me jump into this. First, a little bit about Arteris, the company. We've been around for about 5 years right now. We've had our first employee was about 5 years ago. We've processed 25,000 patient cases on our system in that time. We have over 170 active physicians on our network spread across about 100 hospitals. We are regulated in 28 countries, including, of course, the US, and the US FDA clearance was our first clearance for this product, and then we kind of use that as a jumping off point for those additional clearances in other countries. We actually have 5 FDA Class 2 clearances, 2 of which were focused on products that use deep learning as sort of a fundamental piece, and then 3 for other products. We have about 70 employees spread across 3 offices in San Francisco, Calgary, and Paris, and partnerships for distributing our software with 2 out of the 3 major radiology OEMs, that is Siemens and GE. And we've raised about $45 million in venture funding, including our most recent round in November 2017. So we have 3 products that are cleared right now that are that involve some form of deep learning. The first, which is what I'm going to talk about, is Cardio AI, which is, again, something we got cleared in January of 2017. That's CE marked, FDA cleared, and for sale in 28 countries now. And then more recently, in February of 2018, we got clearance for our lung and liver artificial intelligence products, which right now are focused on segmentation and tracking of lesions. And we're planning on adding additional algorithms and features and expanding those indications over time. So I'm going to talk about specifically the CardioDL product, and I have to give a little bit of anatomical background here. This is a cartoon of the heart, and I'm not going to go into excruciating detail here, except I want to focus your attention on the ventricles. If you can see my mouse, that's great. If not, sorry, but I'm gesturing with my mouse over the left ventricle here, which is the part of the heart that is responsible for pumping oxygenated blood throughout the body, and then the right ventricle here is responsible for pumping deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And the segmentation of those ventricles is the main focus of this deep learning application in our software. The main use case is for patients with heart failure, which is characterized by an inefficient pumping of blood throughout the body, so inefficient operation of the ventricles. And the main metric here is ejection fraction, which is a fraction of blood ejected from the heart in one cardiac cycle. So the goal of the algorithm is to segment the ventricles in order to automatically or semi-automatically, with physician's input, calculate that ejection fraction. So the data set that we use both this is the training data set that we used to build up the model, was around 1,000 de-identified studies. This is a standard imaging protocol for cardiac MRI called steady state free precession, which I'm not going to get into the physics of, and I assume you'll thank me for that. And a typical image looks like what you see on the left here, where this is a cross section through the heart showing the left ventricle, which is on the right side of the image, which is a standard anatomical view, and then the right ventricle on the left side of the image. And we've contoured the endocardium or blood pools of the right ventricle and the left ventricle, that's labeled with endo, and then also the exterior of the muscle surrounding the left ventricle, which is in blue, which we call LV-epi, which stands for epicardium. And those are the main structures that are automatically segmented by this algorithm. So just very briefly about the actual algorithm, this is not a super exciting slide, because if anybody's in the space of deep learning for semantic segmentation, this is really the quintessential network architecture for very many applications in this space. It's a U-net type architecture, which involves a downsampling and then upsampling path, and then skip connections between them. And it's an architecture that was originally proven on cellular images from slides, like slides of cells, and then it's been adapted to many different use cases, including this one here. And you can see on the left side, a single slice of the study comes in. On the right side, the segmentation masks come out. And when it's in our application, we turn those into contours. I'll breeze through this. One really interesting part of the training data was that we were missing some of the labels on some of the images. So just by virtue of the fact that this data was collected as part of standard clinical care, we did not have all 3 of these structures labeled on every image. The details are really not so important, except to say that many of the images had only a subset, 1 or 2 of these 3 contours. So we had to specifically account for that in our training process. Before we actually accounted for that in our training process, and I apologize for people if the video doesn't play smoothly over the call, but the contours did not look very good. And then I'll just say, after including all the data using this adaptation for including the missing data, the contours looked a lot better. Okay, so this is kind of the meat of the presentation for this audience, how we actually evaluated the algorithm. So we had a study with approximately 100 different images, each of which were annotated by a single clinician. And our procedure for actually evaluating the model was sort of straightforward. We performed inference on each of those 100 studies, and then we calculated the relative absolute volume error, or you can think of it as just the relative volume error. So what that means is if the true volume is 100 milliliters and we calculate 110, then the relative absolute volume error is 0.1 or 10%. So that's the metric that we used. These are the results for the different structures, and we found that the contouring works very well with, I would say on average, below 0.05 relative absolute volume error for the left ventricle, and then a little bit higher for the right ventricle. And the two different colors for each of these structures represent the time point at which the heart is maximally contracted, which is labeled ED here. Sorry, I have to explain this verbally. ED or end, sorry, I said this incorrectly. End diastole, which is ED, is when the heart is maximally dilated. End systole, which is labeled ES, is when the heart is maximally contracted. And because there's more ambiguity when the heart is maximally contracted, we tend to have larger relative error. And then the right ventricle error is somewhat higher because the right ventricle is a more complicated shape and tends to also have more inter-reader variability in the ground truth data. So the bottom line is these are the results that we showed to the FDA as part of our application. These came out of sort of the official test protocol we wrote for evaluating this model. And really, in the end, we're trying to show the FDA that we are safe and effective. And the FDA does not actually have a guideline for what is the maximum amount of error you can have per study. So going into this, it was kind of hard for us to tell whether they would accept this or not. But the key feature here is that in the FDA's parlance, this feature is actually a semi-automated feature, which consists of a fully automated component of automatically contouring the ventricles, followed by a human component where the clinician can see the contours and make edits. So that's one of the main reasons this was a class 2 or 510K application, is because the risk to the patient was relatively low, even though there was some automation, because the clinician is still ultimately responsible for refining the contours and ensuring they're correct. And then in addition to this study we did to show the accuracy, we also collected a set of data which had multiple annotators on each study. So we actually had a measure of inter-rater variability for doing these annotations. We had 7 blinded readers annotations for each study. And we used derived metrics from the volume, which are ejection fraction, which again is the efficiency with which the heart is pumping blood, which is just derived from the volume of the blood, and then myocardial mass, which is really just the segmentation of the myocardial muscle surrounding the ventricles. And maybe I'll skip some of the details here, show you the results. The dashed line at 1.0 is the 1 standard deviation of inter-reader variability, just defined as 1.0. And we showed that our accuracy with respect to the consensus from these studies was somewhat below a standard deviation of inter-reader variability. So using this information, we were able to make the claim, which the FDA agreed with, that our model was as accurate as an expert annotator. And then I just want to say again that this is all part of our application, which we actually have for sale. We've had this for sale for about 1.5 years. First ever clinical cloud-based deep learning software to receive FDA clearance, which is something we're very proud of. And our software operates fully cloud-based on AWS. So the user actually uses it through a Chrome web browser. And one amazing thing about the use of cloud-based software, which also enables us to interact with the FDA in new, exciting, and complicated ways, is that we continuously collect edits from users, which allows us to then use those edits to refine our model. So continuous is a loaded term here when I say that this enables us to apply continuous learning, because we don't do this on a really real-time basis. We update our model in a targeted fashion when we think that the return on investment is high from the customer standpoint. But being in the cloud allows us to easily capture this information and make these updates, and that allows us to interact with the FDA in a new way because we've already gotten this model cleared by the FDA. So we get to explore how we deal with the FDA and just making relatively minor updates to the models. And the short version of this, because I suspect there might be questions on this, is that updates like this that are based on new training data but the same model, there are no clear guidelines from the FDA, but our understanding is that these can be notifications to the FDA, what's called a letter to file, where you can make these changes and notify the FDA, and they don't actually need to review those changes that you've made. And that's something we're still exploring the logistics of, but that's our current understanding of that situation. I'm going to skip the demo of our application because it's not going to play well on the screen, and I'll just say that's the end of my presentation for now. Obviously, I'll be available for questions at the end.
Yeah, we can switch back to my screen here.
Can you guys hear me? Can you guys
Yes,
hear me?
Dr. Jha, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation. Secondly, fantastic overview by both Kevin and Daniel. And, I'm actually writing a piece on FDA. I'm just going to nick your slides and write whatever you've said. It's much easier that way. So first and foremost, let me just back up a bit and say that, when we're talking about radiology, whether it's artificial intelligence or some sort of new technology like diagnostic imaging, new modality, we're talking about information. So let me ask you this. Should information be treated the same way as a drug or device? Because I think fundamentally that's really what it boils down to when it comes to the FDA, is when you're providing somebody with information, can you harm as well as do good? And if the answer is yes, then it takes you through a different pathway altogether. So let's start at the beginning. Is information different, or is it the same as drug and device? No feedback? How do I hear? What's that? So I want to get some ideas about that, some ideas about what you think about whether information is different. I realize there's a little bit of a synchronization with audio and
So
well,
I'm going to just act as the moderator here a little bit and challenge Kevin and Dan to answer those questions. But we have a lot of attendees online who can also comment in the question box, and I'll read the answers out to Dr. Jha. So his question is, should information be treated as a drug or device? Yes, no would be great, but I would like to hear the opinions of Bib Allen, Kevin, and Dan, who are on the call.
This is Dan. Should information be treated as a drug or device? Obviously, a decision has already been made by the FDA to treat it as a device. And I think that one of the main distinctions is that there are checkpoints in something like a deep learning model between when the model is invoked and when it affects the patient. And in the example that I showed, the clinician is obligated to provide a second read and really, in the end, the primary read of the accuracy of the model. Whereas with a drug, the patient takes with some exceptions, the patient takes the drug out of the bottle and just the drug, and there are no further checkpoints at that point, except for when the drug has been prescribed. So certainly seems to resemble a device more than a drug to me.
So essentially what you're saying here is that because the radiologist steps in as well, the barrier for this AI platform is going to be lower. Now, that's fine, but when we think about AI, we're thinking about two elements of AI. We're thinking about AI as being an adjunct to what we do, and secondly, we're thinking about AI as actually replacing what we do, so that we do other things. So we're not talking about AI replacing radiologists, we're talking about AI replacing our tasks. Let's start with detection. Now, with detection, you have for example, you have triaging. So let's take the most obvious example that came a few months ago, which is that FDA approved a method of triaging head CTs of intracranial hemorrhage by bringing those that actually they thought had hemorrhage to the top of the list. So when they do that, when AI thinks that there is something important, it has a certain sensitivity and a certain specificity. It's going to get certain things right and it's going to get certain things wrong, and there'll be two types of wrongs, false negative and false positive. We know that. How should FDA deal with these false negatives and false positives? What should it give greater weight to? Should it give greater weight to sensitivity or specificity? And if so, why?
Okay. Dr. Allen, would you like to take that question? You may be on mute.
So,
Sorry.
no, well, I've unmuted myself, and I'm fascinated by that because it is interesting, and I think that what we are seeing is I do think that the fact that physicians are in between how the output of the algorithm and how it's used in clinical practice is important. But I think that at the same time, clinicians, if we have if it starts working too well, then we get an over reliance on it, and then are we actually doing our job? So I think a lot of the philosophical issues around how we deal with what's false positive and what's false negative, and how these should be evaluated. The device question, I think, is probably as we discussed before. I think that for lots of reasons, classifying AI as a device for now makes the most sense. I think that as we go into will AI start replacing certain tasks physicians do, then it becomes a whole other issue of how the FDA and other regulators will evaluate.
So,
I'm not hearing.
Ajay,
Did I answer what you wanted me to answer? I'm not sure I did, but
No, I think, Dr. Allen, you did. You made it clear that ultimately it's very much a philosophical issue, or some of it is. But I think that the FDA at the moment is asking us a fundamental question, which is that, well, they're not really asking us, but I think we have to answer this, which is that when it comes to approval of AI platforms, is it simply a test that is as good as us, or do we want it to be better than us? And I think it is philosophical. I'm going to get back to a conversation I had with IBM senior scientist Tanvir. I forget her last name, so I apologize to Tanvir. But we had a very long discussion, and I said to Tanvir, radiologists were not that great. We hedge a lot. And Tanvir said to me that AI doesn't need to be better than you. AI simply needs to be as good as you. So this is the point I'm making out here, is that when we talk about AI and getting these detection adjunct platforms, what are we considering their minimum standards, and what are we basing that on? Are we basing that on certain colleagues of ours, or are we basing it on some, supernormal person in radiology?
so I'll read some answers for you. So Joe England on Twitter says he does not think AI as information, like information should not be treated as a drug or device, because physicians use medical literature to advise their decisions, and that literature is not subject to FDA review. So AI should not be any different. And Steve, thanks for joining us. And he says information is only information until it's weaponized. So that is put in actionable format. So large, well-organized data sets with the potential for multiple analyses to be performed on it cheaply and quickly. And for the question on true positives and true negatives or sensitivity and specificity, Ajay says sensitivity is what the FDA should focus on because AI needs to be more robust, while Sukanya says it's specificity. So obviously our answers are all over the map. And so, folks, please keep writing on the questions or on Twitter, and I'll keep reading this. But I have a question for you, Dr. Jia. So there are things that are not monitored by the FDA. For example, right now the big area which is pretty disruptive is about policing and use of facial recognition software. So there's not really, real oversight, except the masses and the employees of the big companies who are saying, hey, we don't want to build technology that does this. But what do you think would happen if later on you find that your algorithm is biased to a certain population? Who should keep track of bias, in your opinion?
So I think it's a broader question you're asking, Judy, which is that post-surveillance, whose responsibility it is, and it's our responsibility, without question. It's the responsibility of radiologists, because, as much as we think about AI as being some of us do, not all of us, as being our adversaries, ultimately we are in the same boat, and we have to deal with AI like we deal with our children. I have 2 young boys, and they're a pain to deal with. And so you have to have constant surveillance, and it has to be complete, reassessment. And whether that's going to go through peer review, or that's going to be something that's going to be, based in, like, say, for example, Penn has an AI platform, how it continuously monitors that. But, essentially, it has to be like, that Vioxx drug that came out because, the problems with it because of the lack of surveillance, post-market surveillance. We have to up our game on that tremendously. Not simply because of the bias, although the bias is an important point, but because of the fact that a lot of the times when we build AI platforms, it will be built on certain attributes of test characteristics that will change with time. Put simply, tests get better. We get better diagnosing. We can't base our assessment of ureteric colic or flank pain on technologies that were available in the 1970s. We've evolved, and we're going to continue to evolve. So yes, absolutely, radiologists, it's our responsibility. And I think that the Data Science Institute has a big role in this post-marketing surveillance. You can't leave it to the FDA. The FDA are going to be bandwidth constrained. We have to step up. We have to have our own internal FDA in radiology.
Dan, do you want to comment about the post-market, sort of post-FDA surveillance, and the role of sort of empowering, the doctors, the radiologists who use sort of like your platform to, in their interpretation? How do they, maybe I don't know if there's already a process, but do you mind commenting about this?
Sure. I think the FDA has, first of all, I should say this is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to address this from a sort of a shallow level. But the FDA has a pretty well-established post-market procedure wherein any complaints from users need to be logged and addressed. And of course, if they affect patient safety, then probably a corrective and preventative action needs to be filed and also addressed. So if we're talking about bias, if there are certain patient populations in which the application does not work well at all, then we expect that to at some point manifest as a complaint. And certainly it's the obligation of clinicians to file those complaints if they find that it's not working well. And that's an opportunity for us to address those deficiencies.
Okay. So Dr. Allen, would you like to update us on what the Data Science Institute is doing in terms of the FDA, or
Yeah.
as Dr. Jia would say, the radiologists, we should have our own internal FDA?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right, and this is, what a great segue. I think oh my goodness, that's a big redfish. Where did you find that?
Found that on Google Images pretty quickly, but I bet our audience did not know that Dr. Allen is such a fine fisherman. Pretty cool.
That's great. Good. I hadn't had enough time to do that lately, but at any rate, the Data Science Institute has, absolutely been a wonderful project for me. to stay involved and think about some of these things about the college's role, as Harry says, toward we have to be our, I mean, the role of of our specialty organizations is not only just to represent our members, but also to protect the public. And we have a huge role that we've, a past of lots of things where we've worked with the FDA for mammography and MQSA about accreditation of what we do, now decision support software for, what radiologists do. Radiation protection has certainly been a place where we've worked with the FDA. So I think that there are lots of opportunities. One of the things that we didn't touch on that kind of goes into the future, because none of this is real yet, but a couple of things that the FDA are doing. I think Scott Gottlieb, who's the administrator, has said in many of his blogs and speeches and so forth, is that really trying to decrease this time to market for products. And how can we do that? And one of the things that they're emphasizing is if we can have a certain level of validity and safety going in, that we can use this post-market surveillance process to help us continually evaluate these products. And so the NEST program that the FDA has recently announced sort of looks at how we can use post-market surveillance. And to Dr. Jha's point of what's the Data Science Institute up to in that, the ACR registry program in many areas has been very important to radiologists. I mean, you can look at the research registries, the NOPAR for how we got PET approved, the registries now that we're using for gathering data around radiation dose, also for just doing things of quality in practices to comply with all the macro regulations. And so we envision an opportunity to collect these data regards post-market surveillance through the use of these registries. And how that might work is that within the dictation software itself would understand whether or not and there could be other things. I don't want to just say that it has to be there. It could be within the PACS. It would be sort of tailored to the use case for the algorithm. But that in the course of the workflow, not something that's any different than just the workflow, it would allow a radiologist to either use the result of the algorithm or change the result of the algorithm, and it would understand that happened when it saw how the radiologist did their report. And then that information would be captured in the dictation software, transmitted to the registry, but not just the yes or no, did it work or not, but then in the background, all of the metadata around the examination. So what were some of the things going on about that patient? What was the slice thickness? What was the type of CT scanner? So in the wild, where you might have had an algorithm that was approved with a limited amount of data going in from, say, a single institution or maybe just a couple, to now working in the wild, you can see sort of what the biases would be. Like in the simple example of a stroke detector, it works beautifully, except we find in the surveillance process that it works everywhere except, and I'm not going to pick on Philips, I'm just going to say 3T Philips magnets. It just didn't work, and we don't know why it didn't work. But then that data comes back and it informs the developer who can update the algorithm. And then as Daniel was saying, update the algorithm just with a notification that, yes, we've identified this, we've notified the public, and yes, we've now fixed our algorithm, so we've corrected that problem. On the another program they have is they call the Medical Device Development Toolkit, again, and this is on the horizon. So what are some of the tools that people can use potentially in this pre-certification process that might allow specific ways to validate an algorithm in the pre-market review process. And so the ACR is working with a number of institutions around our lung cancer screening use case for lung-RADS classification of pulmonary nodules. And we're doing this as part of a NEST demonstration project, not only to test our thoughts about being able to capture post-market surveillance type data and monitoring with the registry program, but also individually, what are some of these statistical metrics and so forth that can be used? Because I think it's important that as we validate algorithms, we'd like to have as big a pool of diversity to have a data set for validating algorithms, potentially from multiple institutions that a developer could use to test that algorithm to, again, what Judy was talking about, decrease geographic or technical or other diversity issues so that there won't be unintended bias. And this is sort of the validation program that we're working on. And so those are the two things that I think that the Data Science Institute can play a role and be actually helpful to developers in moving products through the FDA process, but at the same time adhering to the college's mission of patient safety and protecting the public. And I think that we have a much better opportunity, even than the FDA, to be able to do those things. So thank you all for letting me participate tonight. That's about all I wanted to say.
I'm going to yes, go ahead, Dan.
I wanted to respond very briefly to something Bib said that I really agree with. The concept of monitoring the performance after the algorithm has been released, especially in patient subsets or scanner cases where it doesn't work, is really important because it's enormously expensive to get this training data. And optimally, you want training data that represents all possible use cases in the wild, but this is in real life completely impractical, and you end up getting data opportunistically. So the opportunity and tools to iterate on the initial versions of the algorithm and refine them where they don't work after it's gone to market are actually really valuable.
I do want to ask you guys something, which is that since we're running out of time, people are going to have to answer very rapidly. When it comes to diagnosis, it's a completely different ballgame. At that point, what do you want? Do you want, I mean, when I say what do you want, I mean what do the radiologists want? Because the FDA, they haven't quite gone to that stage yet because we haven't given them that. Do you want RCTs that show that AI does better than radiologists in certain tasks, therefore a net benefit? Or do you want RCTs which have not, are like non-inferiority trials where it shows, yes, within a certain limit, they're just as good? I reckon that's the question that we're going to have to answer in 2 to 3 years' time. When it comes to diagnosis, how are we going to show that that AI systems, or not we, somebody else, is as good as or better, or which one should we show?
Well, I'm going to take a stab at that because I've got sort of a lot of passion about what I think the future holds for radiologists and AI working together. I think to look at some of the simplistic things, sort of, I mean, I don't want to be pejorative in that statement, but the idea that we have to have a contest to see whether the machine can be better than the radiologist, and we're going to have an ROC curve for the machine, or one for the radiologist and one for my partner who's smarter than I am, or that we're going to stack up all these ROC curves to decide what's the best thing to do. To me, AI in medicine is not like playing Jeopardy, man. I mean, the idea of AI, what I want to see for our specialty in the next 10 to 15 years is that AI allows us to do things that we couldn't have even thought about doing before, that we are so much more valuable to our health systems that we were because we figured out how to harness AI to solve the challenges that we have, and not just say, oh yeah, the machine can say that's a normal, wrist X-ray, so yeah, the radiologist doesn't need to do that. I mean, that may be fine, but at the same time, we have to trade that with all of the things that we can unleash with AI. I think if AI developers only focus is to just be better than Bib Allen, they are totally wasting the opportunity and talent that they have to really leverage AI for healthcare. And that's my passion.
Dan, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I think I would say that it's not for me to determine what is most useful to the customer. I think for a company making a product like ours, these things all need to be tested very rigorously within a standard product management sort of way with the customers to see what's most valuable to them and what isn't. And I think definitely the concept of being better than a radiologist is not very appealing to radiologists if they're your customers, because you don't want to put them out of work. And I think I agree completely with Bib that we want to remove tedious tasks that they don't want to do anyway. So maybe determining the likelihood of a wrist fracture could be one of those tedious tasks, or in my case, segmenting the ventricles and so on. But then also allow them to spend more time on the much more valuable things, like complex cases and integrating very disparate data, like EHR records as well as radiology, that are extremely challenging for computers to do right now, and let the AI, at least in the near term, do these more menial tasks that are simple, straightforward, and don't provide much intellectual stimulation for the radiologists.
I'm going to ask some questions from our attendees, and then I'll ask one more question, and Kevin will ask the last question. And so Brett asked this, maybe I have missed this, but what was the correction method for the missing data? I presume that question is for you, Dan.
Yeah, and in the time we have left, I don't think I have time to go into the details. But it essentially sort of learned from each type of label independently. And then if you want to use some deep learning terminology, only backpropagated loss for the labels that were present in the given training image. So that's the real quick answer.
Okay.
To get more audience questions, so feel free to type out any question you might have, and we'll ask it here in the last few minutes. One question I kind of had for Dan, actually, something I was curious about. Dan, you probably have the most kind of practical experience of sort of going through the process. I'm curious, what about, the practicalities of the process really kind of surprised you? And then, what do you wish you had known in retrospect when you were starting out and just kind of learning about this stuff and initially submitting things and doing the testing?
I would say, I assume you mean the process of submitting and getting a 510K clearance?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say that there's a lot of sort of confusion and consternation about the process. And in the end, there have been machine learning algorithms in radiology software for a long time, and practically they have not worked nearly as well as deep learning does. But CAD, for example, has been around for a long time. So I don't think that a lot of these things are fundamentally different from the existing, maybe less effective techniques. I think really the FDA is most concerned about the inputs and the outputs especially how accurate they are and the effect on the patient, and the actual tools like that, whether it's deep learning or whether it's some sort of traditional handcrafted feature-based method. I think honestly it doesn't matter that much and shouldn't matter that much, and really the proof of the pudding should be in the eating, and if the technique works well, then that's really what matters. And knowing that at the outset would have reduced our consternation. I'm not sure if it would have changed our methodology, but I think that's the honest truth about how this process works.
Okay. So James, always with good questions. Thank you for joining us. So he commented that this was a comment to Dr. Jha. Balance of sensitivity and specificity has to be use case specific, because too much sensitivity is a bad thing because of the proportionality with false positive. For example, in your intracranial hemorrhage example, 100% sensitivity renders this clinically useless, because if there are too many false positives, then many of the detections start being ignored by the clinician, whether they're true or positive. And I think we've seen this with a little bit of CAD. And so, future Dr. Mukhtar says, asks the panelists, I know the webinar is focused on the US FDA approval process, but if I may, are there other developed markets that are more amenable, approval process timeline, cost to market to AI innovation in radiology and healthcare? And I think that's a good question for you, Dan, because you actually span your wings beyond the US. Have you had to undergo approvals in other countries or other regions, and what's been sort of similarities and differences with that, with America?
Yeah, sure. I can touch on that briefly. So yeah, we have clearances in 28 different countries. That slide's a little bit old. It might even be a few more now. And the US FDA is certainly the most difficult. And a lot of our other applications in other countries follow from the content of that original 510K submission in the US. I think Europe, compared to the European Union, compared to the US, tends to require a little bit less burden of proof for an initial submission. But of course, one still needs to make sure you are evaluating your algorithms properly, because you're subject to audit by the European Union for the CE mark. So Europe is very appealing because there's less of this initial barrier, but any companies that are going in that direction, and in other countries as well, certainly need to understand that they still need to have very rigorous quality procedures and need to evaluate their algorithms properly and document it and so on. Otherwise, under an audit, they will be in trouble.
I'm going to sort of take this opportunity to thank our panelists, but also ask you one last question. So during the, the keynote, the closing session, the Keith Dwyer session, not the Keith Dwyer, sorry, the Dwyer lecture session at SIM, Dr. Langkotz was said that maybe the barrier for AI is to massively release these curated data sets. And I think Stanford has been pretty forward about this, where we'd have these curated data sets and anyone can actually do AI, which is something I think is an interesting way to think about democratizing AI. I wonder, what are you excited about right now? And what do you think would be sort of the next disruption when you think about AI in radiology and healthcare? And of course, this is guesswork, because no one can really know, but I'm curious to hear your opinion, and you can say your closing mark as you answer my question.
So, Judy, your question is brilliant because it's speculative, but it also kind of gets us to unravel our feelings about AI. My feelings about AI are probably a little bit different to Dr. Allen's, in that I do think that it's a technology that should take some of our tasks. It can't be disruptive if it's simply being an adjunct. I have radiology residents. I don't want another radiology resident. I don't want AI to be another radiology resident. I want it to do stuff that I do, and I want it to do it well, meaning I'm not going to relinquish it if I see it doing it poorly. But there's some stuff that I do that I want it to do well. I want it to spot endotracheal tube misplacements, small pneumothoraces, take care of ICU plain films. And the only way I think it can actually do that is by putting itself in the diagnosis realm and actually, coming match to match with us, so that we can actually move to more complex stuff. So I do wish for it to be, competing with us. That's the only way I reckon we're going to do patient service. And in order for it to prove itself, we need RCTs, randomized controlled trials, which show positive benefit of AI. Good enough is not good enough.
Okay. Dan, do you have any comments to my question?
Sure, I'll just quickly respond to that. But the randomized controlled trials, I agree, are a great gold standard for evaluating the efficacy of these algorithms. But my company is a startup. A lot of other startup companies are interested in getting into this space. Randomized controlled trials can take years and cost millions of dollars. And I really hope there's a way to have that burden of proof without resorting to those. And this could be a much longer conversation. So maybe I'll just go on to the original question, which is what I'm most excited about. And I would say, I don't see this happening immediately, but synthesizing disparate data sources. So data from the EHR, as well as data from images from radiology, data from tests, from genomics, and so on. This is all the data that clinicians actually use to make diagnoses, especially complex diagnoses in practice. And right now, a lot of deep learning algorithms, including ours, honestly, are leaving a lot of this data on the table. So being able to synthesize all that data and combining it into making a collective diagnosis that has all of the available information is really what is going to be needed to have the next big leap in AI helping in clinical diagnosis.
Dr. Elam, do you have any final comments?
Well, sure. I'll always have a comment, but I think I agree that it's probably impractical considering the number of tasks that radiologists do. I think that we could figure out how to have randomized trials for every single use case for AI. And so I'm sort of in the camp that if we can promote some of these public-private partnerships where and I've obviously I'm partial to specialty societies, but as Kevin said, developers who can build their own credibility, with the regulators, can certainly we can figure out some ways to streamline the getting the products to practice. How can we go beyond something happening at a single institution, going just into their individual workflow? And I think I think that's something that we as a specialty can work together on and be able to get these things into our practices sooner. And so as far as the future though, yeah, absolutely. Data integration is going to be a great opportunity for AI. And again, finding the things, using AI to see the things that radiologists can't see, using AI to predict which patients can benefit from exams that aren't getting exams yet. How can we figure out that patient who has a high likelihood of having a pancreatic cancer before not only before they have a symptom, but how do we make all of that cost effective? And I think that AI is poised to do some of that for us. So again, thank you for letting me participate tonight, Judy. I appreciate it.
Okay. So I'm going to thank all our panelists and most especially our attendees, because we'd never have this journal club without you. Our next one will be in July. I'd like to pose a question to you. Would people be interested in trying out a journal club at 12:30, close to like noon conference, and try alternating those? Please send me a message if you have this. And I'm going to especially thank Dr. Kevin Seals for an amazing session, and give him the spot to close this journal club, because I thought he was fantastic. And thank you so much for preparing for this journal club. Dr. Seals?
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. That was a lot of fun. Panelists were all incredible. I really appreciate your time. And thank you, Judy, for everything, helping organize and creating this journal club. So it's been a pleasure, everyone. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you for the invitation. Great stuff, chaps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin and Judy.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. And thanks, Catherine, for your help.